channel. Thank you for joining me for today's video. I'm going to be reading from Eyewitness Tudor, and this is part 1, so I hope you enjoy it. Let's get started. Who were the Tudors? In 1485, a new family or dynasty of rulers seized the throne of England. The Tudors ruled until 1603, producing two of England's most colourful and successful monarchs, Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. Yet they might never have ascended to the throne. From 1154 to 1399, England had been ruled by a family called the Plantagenets. Then the crown was taken by the Lancaster family. But in 1455, a rival family, the Yorks, threatened the throne. Fighting broke out between them, and their battles became known as the Wars of the Roses. The Tudors inherited the Lancastrian claim when most of the Lancaster family was killed. In 1485, Henry Tudor defeated the Yorkist king, Richard III, in battle and became King Henry VII. John of Gaunt. Henry Tudor's claim to the throne lay on his mother's side. Her great-grandfather was the fourth son of King Edward III, John of Gaunt. As Duke of Lancaster, John of Gaunt was a powerful figure in 14th century England. Wars of the Roses. 10 major battles and a few minor skirmishes were fought during the 30-year-long Wars of the Roses, essentially a family quarrel between the royal houses of Lancaster and York. The wars finally ended when the Lancastrian claimant, Henry Tudor, defeated and killed the Yorkist king, Richard III, in battle at Bosworth Field in Leicestershire on the 22nd of August, 1485. The Tudor royal family tree. Tudor rose denotes the reign of the Tudor monarch. Henry VII, 1485 to 1509, Margaret, James V of Scotland, Mary Queen of Scots, James I or the Sixth of Scotland, 1603 to 1625, Arthur, 1502, Henry VIII, 1509 to 1547, Mary I, 1553 to 1558, Elizabeth I, 1558 to 1603, Edward VI, 1547 to 1553, Mary, Frances, and Lady Jane Grey. A New Rose. The Wars of the Roses were named after the emblems used by the royal houses of Lancaster and York. A red rose for Lancaster and a white rose for York. After becoming king, Henry Tudor married Elizabeth of York, uniting the two rival houses. Henry combined the white rose of York with the red rose of Lancaster to make a new emblem, the Tudor rose. The great rose window in the south transept of York Minster commemorates this marriage and the subsequent union of the York and Lancaster families and the new Tudor dynasty. Henry Tudor was born here at Pembroke Castle, Wales, in 1457. Then Earl of Richmond, Henry had only a distant claim to the throne. but in time the lack of other suitable claimants increased his importance. By 1471 he was a real threat to the throne, and his uncle took him to Brittany, France, for his own protection. Henry's Welsh heritage was important to him. He landed in Wales to claim his throne in 1485, and most of his troops at Bosworth were Welsh. It is probable that he had spent only a few weeks in total in England before he became its king. Henry was born here, in this tower. This is an outer defensive wall. A cylindrical great tower dominates the castle. The first Tudor king. Henry VII was a shrewd man who, having seized the throne by force, kept it through the subtle use of royal power and strong government. Suspicious and insecure, he was the first English king to have his own personal bodyguard, the Yeoman of the Guard, still on duty today at the Tower of London. But Henry was a successful king, building up the national finances, encouraging trade, and largely keeping England out of foreign entanglements. When he died in 1509, England was the most peaceful and prosperous it had been for half a century. Flags like this were used to rally knights and soldiers on the battlefield during the Wars of the Roses. Henry was determined to break the power of the warlike English nobles by banning them from raising their own personal armies. This helped end the recurring civil wars between members of the royal family. Richmond Palace. Henry had a number of royal palaces to live in, but his favourite was Richmond Palace, built on the site of Sheen Palace by the River Thames in Surrey, which had burned down in 1499. Henry died here in 1509, as did Elizabeth I almost a century later. Patron of the arts, Henry was a learned and cultured man. He encouraged French and Italian scholars and artists to come to England, bringing the latest ideas from the new spirit of learning, which would become known as the Renaissance. Among them was the famous Italian sculptor Pietro Torrigiano, 1472 to 1528, who made this bust of Henry. The Royal Union. Henry's wife, Elizabeth of York, was the sister of Edward V, who was deposed before his coronation could take place in 1483, and probably murdered, although theirs was a marriage of political convenience, uniting the rival houses of York and Lancaster. It was also a love match. The couple had 8 children, and Henry was devastated when Elizabeth died shortly after the birth of their final daughter in February 1503. Elizabeth of York, King Henry VII. Henry's death. Henry died in April 1509 and was buried beside his wife in Westminster Abbey, the final resting place of all Tudor monarchs, except Henry VIII. Although respected as a king, Henry was not loved. At his funeral, John Fisher, Bishop of Rochester, acknowledged that, "King Henry, if thou were alive again, many one that is here present now would pretend a full great pity and tenderness upon thee." Thrifty policies. When Henry became king, England was almost bankrupt. The because of the civil wars of preceding years. Through careful nurturing of the royal finances, he personally checked and signed every page of his own household's accounts. He built up a substantial income and left the crown in surplus at his death. Henry's policies were not popular, though. His two main tax collectors were put to death a year after Henry died, to considerable popular acclaim. Henry and his wife were both keen supporters of England's first printer, William Caxton, 1420 to 91. In 1476, Caxton printed the first edition of Geoffrey Chaucer's poem, The Canterbury Tales. Above is his 1483 second edition, which had illustrations added. The stories of pilgrims on their way to Canterbury proved very popular, and the book is still read today. New worlds discovered. In 1492, the Italian navigator Christopher Columbus, 1451 to 1506, stumbled upon the islands of the Caribbean while in search of a new westerly sea route to Asia. Columbus's voyage attracted huge attention in England, and Henry joined in enthusiasm, sponsoring the voyages of the Cabots to North America in 1497. The Santa Maria, Columbus's flagship. Tudor England. In 1500, the population of England was a mere 2.6 million. London was the only major city, and most people lived in small market towns or in isolated rural areas. Tudor society was divided into three main classes: a small nobility, a larger professional and middle class, and a big working class of skilled craftsmen, farm workers, servants, and labourers. Travel was much more uncommon than it is today. Few left the district in which they were born, and foreign journeys were extremely rare. The export of woolen cloth to Europe was the most valuable overseas trade of its day, rising by more than 60% during Henry VII's reign alone. Most farmers, therefore, kept sheep, but this eventually led to a shortage of crops. Farming the land. The crops Tudor farmers grew were similar to those grown today, and included wheat, barley, oats, peas, beans, and root crops. They also kept cattle, pigs, and poultry. Farmers worked the land by hand, ploughing the fields with teams of oxen or horses, and making their own tools. Houses had wooden frames filled in with whitewashed brick or thin wood. The farmer's wife. The life of a farmer's wife was busy and hard. On top of the normal household chores, she had to make butter, cheese, and beer, collect eggs, apples, and other fruit, and make clothes for her family. She could supplement the family income by selling any excess produce. Hard labour. The vast majority of people in Tudor England worked as agricultural labourers or husbandmen on farms owned by wealthy landowners. A few were yeoman farmers owning their own small parcels of land, which they worked as family business. Husbandsmen received a weekly wage, being paid in clothing, food, and drink. Merry England. Weddings were celebrated with great gusto, as the painting of this wedding in Bermondsey, now in South London, but then still a village, shows. Guests contributed food and drink to the feast, and brought their own musical instruments. A good wedding party might start before the happy couple had even got to the church and could continue for days. The middle class, the landowners, merchants, professionals, such as lawyers and others who made up the middle class, were the backbone of Tudor England. They served in the government, enforced the law as justices of the peace, and sat in Parliament. Many lived in small manor houses on their estates or in well-appointed townhouses. Hardwick Hall in Derbyshire. Glass windows were a recent innovation and extremely expensive when this house was built. The nobility lived in ancestral castles or, in later years, country houses with dozens of bedrooms. Hardwick Hall, built in the 1590s as a deliberate display of wealth, is one such house. It was described as more glass than wall because of its huge windows, which let lots of light into the spacious interior. The nobility. At the start of the Tudor period, the aristocracy consisted of just 38 noble families. Most held great power locally as landowners and employers of rural labour. Their wives and daughters were well provided for, living in considerable luxury with fine clothes and numerous servants to look after them. Tudor feasting. The English had a reputation for gluttony among their continental peers. The rich did enjoy large, expensive meals, but they were as much for show as for consumption. Henry VIII once gave a 10-course banquet for a visiting ambassador that lasted more than 7 hours. Even ordinary people ate better than their European cousins. A vast array of food was available from within England, and overseas trade meant that goods such as sugar and spices were imported, though these were expensive. Leftovers from sumptuous meals were passed on to the servants to take what they wanted and give the rest to the poor who gathered around the gates of noble houses. The Tudor kitchen was a place to cook, eat, and socialise. Grander kitchens had large ovens and adjoining sculleries, cold stores for meat, bakeries, and wine cellars. Poorer kitchens were less ostentatious and often had no oven, but whatever their size, all were dominated by the open fire used for boiling large cauldrons of water, roasting meats and birds on a rotating spit, and cooking stews and other dishes. Peacock on a plate. At a Tudor feast, it was just as important for each dish to look spectacular as well as taste delicious. Peacock royal was a particularly popular dish. A peacock was skinned, stuffed with dried fruits and spices, cooked, and then placed back inside its feathered skin. Tudor cooks would also have been required to stuff swans, bake porpoise pie, and roast blackbirds and larks. The crystal wine glass presented to Elizabeth I. Wine glasses were fashionable in the homes of the rich and noble. They were imported from Venice and Italy, making them a very expensive luxury. Goblets were more commonly made of wood, pewter or silver, and very rarely gold. Flavouring. Herbs were widely used to season food and drink, as well as being used in medicine. They were collected locally from the wild or grown in gardens alongside flowers and vegetables. Rich people had specially created herb gardens. Most knives in England came from Sheffield, where they had been manufactured since the 1300s. Even in the noblest house, food was cut up with a knife and then eaten with the fingers. Forks were not introduced until the end of the 16th century. Silver spoons. The poor used wooden spoons, but rich people had spoons of pewter or silver. These might be engraved with the family coat of arms or carry an emblem or figure at the top of the handle. Owning an engraved silver spoon was a way of proclaiming one's wealth and status in society. Some people carried their own spoons about with them. Farm workers ate rabbits, blackbirds, pigeons, partridges, pheasants, and other wildfowl they caught in the fields and woods. Fish were caught from local lakes and rivers, and capons or hens and ducks were farmed. The wealthy ate all of these as well as the more expensive meat of geese, swans, boars, and deer. The diet of the wealthy consisted mainly of meat. Vegetables were looked down upon as food for the poor. Fantastic puddings. Sugar was an expensive luxury in Tudor times, so sweet desserts were out of the price range of ordinary people, provided another opportunity for the upper class to display their wealth. Marzipan or marchpane, a mixture of ground almonds, sugar and rosewater, was fashioned into castles, animals or flowers to form an impressive-looking sweet course at a Tudor banquet. The marchpane was coloured using vegetable dyes such as saffron for yellow and parsley for green. Marzipan or marchpane castle. Decorative rose petals. Honey was an affordable alternative to sugar. It was used to baste meats and ferment drinks, and it could also be used medicinally. Honey can keep for a year or more, and the Tudors suspended fruits in it to preserve them into the winter months. English honey had a fine reputation and was exported in large quantities to France and other countries. Spices from the Americas and Eastern Asia were used to season both sweet and savoury food, and wine, ale, and other drinks. One of the highest priced spices was nutmeg. Wealthy, stylish people carried their own nutmeg and a special nutmeg grater with them to avoid the stale, ready ground powder often served at table. Ornate trenchers. During the reign of Elizabeth I, it became fashionable to use ornate trenchers, little square plates for pastries and other delicacies. Once the food was eaten, the diner turned the trencher over and read or sang the verse that was printed on the other side. The court of Henry VIII. Henry VIII succeeded his father, Henry VII, to the throne in 1509, aged 17. Many welcomed his accession, especially those nobles and merchants who had been persecuted and heavily taxed by his father. Henry VIII's style of kingship was flamboyant, and he hoped to make an impact, through both war and diplomacy, on the European stage. Henry was also devoted to pleasure, activity, and enjoyed sports, music, and dancing, and lavish banquets. His extravagant lifestyle wasted much of the money Henry's prudent father had saved. The Dutch scholar Desiderius Erasmus, 1467 to 1536, was one of Europe's leading intellectuals, writing extensively on religious affairs and education. A visitor to Henry's court, he did much to introduce new ideas and learning to England. The The Renaissance in England. Henry VII had shown interest in the ideas of the Renaissance, but his son did more to bring the new learning to England. His intellectual curiosity led him to support many Renaissance scholars and artists. This masterpiece by Hans Holbein, 1497 to 1543, Henry's court artist, depicts two diplomats with some of the latest scientific instruments of the day. Henry's music. As a youth, Henry learned to play several musical instruments, including the organ, the virginals, a type of harpsichord, the lute and the harp, all to a high standard. He also composed music, writing church masses and 18 songs and ballads, as well as 15 instrumental pieces. His name has been linked with Greensleeves, one of the most famous of English folk songs, although there is no direct evidence that Henry was its composer. A harp of the Tudor period. The rise and fall of Wolsey. The first advisor to the king was Thomas Wolsey, 1475 to 1529. The son of an Ipswich butcher, Wolsey rose through the church to become Archbishop of York in 1514 and Cardinal a year later. As Chancellor of England from 1515, he managed the affairs of state for Henry with great skill, amassing huge wealth for himself in the process. He fell out of the king's favour in 1529, but died before he could be tried for treason. The young king was an imposing man, standing 6'4" tall, with broad shoulders, fair skin and red hair, but with a high-pitched, thin voice. He was highly intelligent, and as well as enjoying sport and music, wrote books on religious theory or theology, and revelled in intellectual debate. In his youth he was physically fit, but a lifetime of eating and drinking heavily took its toll, and in his later years he became so fat that a special machine was needed to haul him upstairs. This is a portrait of Henry VIII by Hans Holbein, 1537. A sporting life. Henry was addicted to sport and especially enjoyed riding and jousting. Jousting tournaments were held at court on important holy days and on special occasions, such as the birth of a royal prince or the visit of a foreign envoy. The illustration above shows Henry jousting before his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, in 1512, to celebrate the birth of his first son, Henry. His joy at having a son was short-lived, for the child died when he was just 3 months old. Hunting and hawking. When he wasn't jousting, Henry hunted stags, or, when hunting stopped for the winter, hawked with falcons bred especially for the sport. Most of Henry's youth was spent in the saddle, leaving him little time for anything else. The Tudor chronicler Edward Hall wrote of 1526 that, because all this summer the king took his pastime in hunting, nothing happened worthy to be written of. Henry's policy. Henry's policy towards France, England's old enemy, veered between friendship and open warfare. After invading France in 1513, Henry made peace and within a year had married his sister Mary to the French king, Louis XVIII. More years of war followed until 1520, when Wolsey organised a meeting between Henry and the new king, Francis I, to sign a treaty of friendship. They met at the Field of the Cloth of Gold, so called because of the richly decorated tents erected there. But 2 years later they were at war again. Henry rides to meet the French king. And this is where I'm going to end the video. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, I hope you join me again soon for part 2. Thank you for watching. Bye.